Alex, you're back. It's so exciting to see you after your extended sojourn. How are you feeling on your return?
Yes, I know that WhatsOnStage Podcast listeners will have been anxiously waiting by their wirelesses to find out where I've been for the last 4 or 5 weeks. I've been on parental leave, which as a first-time parent has been a huge gear shift in terms of social life, nightlife, going from trying to come back from press nights at 1 a.m. to trying to stay awake at 1 a.m. with a newborn, and generally floating through all the chaos that having a newborn child entails. It's kind of like having a small drunk person that you have to take care of that then likes to loll around and throw themselves at your forehead when they're hungry. But it has been such a joy going into the spring, building on the family, and yes, now
Little
coming back.
person.
Yeah, coming back, and also coming back to work. Thankfully, being able to still spend time with her, and also, you know, hopefully one day she'll be playing young Cosette in the West End, and then she can pay her way through the next 20 years of musical theatre.
Yeah, the only thing I know as an older parent is that it's absolutely impossible to predict what they'll be doing in the next 20 years. However,
true.
I mean, it has been lovely. And for me, because I have been speaking to you, though I haven't been podcast recording, it's been so exciting to see you going through the early days of parenthood and with your wife. And I think you're doing really well, actually. I feel that when I first had a baby, I was just lying flat for at least 2 weeks, but you've been very buoyant and back in the swing of things very soon. And so welcoming everybody to this week's episode of the What's on Stage podcast with me, Sarah Crompton.
And me, Alex Wood.
It was amazing to me that you not only managed to get out of the house, but to put a DJ on and go to the Olivier Awards. And we thought we'd make that the theme of this week's episode. So what was it like going? Because I didn't go. I lazily stayed at home.
Well, it was quite disorienting to go from doing night shifts, waiting to be sort of like retched on by a newborn with lots of milk, and instead being surrounded by the great and the good of the theatre world, trying to hobnob whilst forgetting that most of the time you're just making echoed baby noises. So it's sort of like recalibrating my senses to some extent. But it was a lovely...
I don't know, it might be perfect practice dealing
with some theatre world, yeah. No, it was so lovely to see so many brilliant people, and actually people that had been sort of like following this journey into parenthood. So I remember just before going on parental leave having a really extended conversation with Drew McConey about what it means to be a parent when you're working in the theatre industry, and he was incredibly eloquent about the way that you value your time shifts so much, because when you're not a parent, you sort of have your working hours and then you might drip feed into the evenings and work beyond that time, just because theatre is so all-encompassing. But when you become a parent, Drew was saying that, you know, you get to 6 o'clock and you just want to down tools and just go and hang out with them and sort of like feast on that brilliant time of life. So that it was kind of nice to reconvene with Drew McConey at the Olivier Awards in the Winners' Room, because Regent's Park Open Air Theatre picked up 3 prizes for its brilliant production of Fiddler on the Roof, which was one of the big winners on the night, in an evening that was very well spread in terms of there wasn't a big seismic winner like there was with Sunset Boulevard or Cabaret or productions like that. There was quite a lot of really wonderful names being recognised across different fields with a few trends, but it was very nice to know that you weren't seeing the same faces time and time again every time a show won a different prize.
Yeah, and I felt that sort of watching the winners come through at home. So I was watching the What's on Stage feed and realising who was winning what. And obviously Fiddler on the Roof was nominated for 13 awards, and it could have done the Sunset Boulevard sweep, but it was really nice that it didn't. I felt I adored that production, as everybody knows, and I was so overexcited that I went on BBC News and announced Tim Scott as the director rather than as the art director. So I'd like to take this opportunity to apologise for that. But I did adore it, and I was so pleased it won Best Musical, Best Design and Best Sound Design, because that was a recognition of how brilliant it was. But it was lovely that there were other winners like The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, like Oliver, which took lighting for the magnificent Paoli Constable.
And Ben Jacobs.
Yes, and Ben Jacobs. Sorry, I always forget Ben Jacobs. I do apologise to Ben Jacobs.
Yeah.
And choreography went to Christopher Wheeldon. So there was a nice spread of different winners. And I was pleased with that because I feel that's what awards ceremonies should do. You were also saying that Jordan Fine made a terrific speech on the night.
Yes,
who did direct.
He did direct Fiddler on the Roof.
Tom Scott.
There was sort of a lull in the winners' room where I was based because I was doing the interviews with the winners as they were coming through off stage. Everyone gathered around TV screens to watch his speech where he was talking about the pertinence of this production of Fiddler on the Roof. And then talking to him afterwards on the media line, he was discussing how his grandmother had been relocated from Kyiv when she was younger. So there's something very personal about this production for him. And the way that, well, we've discussed this many times on the podcast, but the way that he blends the historical with the contemporary, with the ahistorical in this production feels so pronounced and almost painfully present in the way that he directs it. And to know that that comes from a place of lived experience to some extent, to have heard those things passed down through generations in a very direct way, it makes me appreciate that production all the more. I cannot wait to see it again when it transfers to the Barbican. And then it's got a huge tour as well. I think it's been over a decade since Fiddler on the Roof has been touring across the UK, but I think it will really bring out audiences and make them appreciate what a well-crafted revival can look like when it's hitting regional venues. It's so lovely to see that production being recognised. I think it was an incredibly strong year for musical revivals yet again. But looking back, that was the one that sort of transcended the theatre world and spoke about something a lot more universal in a way that you might not have got from something like a Starlight Express or an Oliver, which obviously are brilliant commodities in their own right, but speaking to the present time. And I think that's what awards allow you to do. They allow you to take what happens within the theatre bubble and apply it to a wider context. One other side note I wanted to talk about was the wonderful Nick Lidster, who is the sound designer for Fiddler on the Roof. And I was asking him about what it's like sound designing the production. And he said, look, when you're outside, there's literally nothing to help you. You just got speakers and you've got to make it work. And in fairness to him, you don't miss a single vowel in the sound design of that production. And he is such an asset to Regent's Park in the way that he designs the sounds, not only for their big musicals, but often for a lot of their shows throughout the season, making that space, which could be so inaccessible audibly, feel so well crafted in terms of how the sound design works. So it's so lovely to see him recognised. Yeah, and he was so brilliant. Earnest. Yeah, he was a lovely man.
And he could have even more fun at the Barbican. I mean, I totally agree with you about that Fiddler on the Roof. I do tend to like it, as you reminded me. I really liked Trevor Nunn's production a few years back. But it was the first production I had seen that did seem as if it was happening now as well as then. It does this remarkable thing of straddling time so that you feel that the experiences you're watching in a fictional setting are both real historically and going on all over the world now. And it's very interesting that does obviously spring partly from Jordan Fine's own feelings and own understanding. I think it's brilliant that people will be able to see it, because that is always a frustration of awards season, that you sometimes are rewarding shows that have vanished. And this time, it's on at the Barbican, people can book. It's fabulous. And the same is true of another of the night's big winners, which was Giant, which won Mark Rosenblatt Best Play and John Lithgow Best Actor. I mean, quite surprising, that one, in the sense that I did think Adrian Brody might win Best Actor.
Me too.
Because he was brilliant. But I'm glad it was Lithgow, because it's such a characterful performance. I can't imagine anyone but John Lithgow catching that sense of Roald Dahl being both charming and funny and seductive, and a monstrous anti-Semite who you want not to have anything to do with. And I thought he was magnificent in that part. So I was glad that he won it. And it also won...
Elliot Levy won.
Elliot Levy, an award.
Had a very funny moment with him because he was coming off a very bruising interview with, I think, the Sunday Times and the Stage about the show. And then he saw the WhatsOnStage branded microphone. And he was like, oh, I feel like I've come home. Now I can talk to WhatsOnStage. They're an easier ride than the Sunday Times. So I was like, yeah.
Why were they giving him a hard time? Do you know why
I just think it's, like you were saying about Giant as a play, because of its subject matter and not simply the themes that underpin the show, but the fact of all the individuals. You're going after Roald Dahl, who is so interwoven in the literary canon. Everywhere you look, really, Roald Dahl is there. You read his book to your kids, you go and see Matilda in the West End, you watch the Matilda film, everywhere is Roald Dahl. To go for the Giant and to try and take him down is a big conversation starter. And also, I think for journalists, it's a very rich vein to tap into, because especially if you're somewhere like the Sunday Times, you want to have that conversation because you know it's going to provoke a response. And in fairness to Mark Rosenblatt and to Elliot Levy and John Lithgow, they are so polished with the way that they discuss the themes of anti-Semitism, and yet sort of package up the paradoxes that sit at the heart of Dahl. Mark Rosenblatt saying when he won for Best New Play in the Winner's Room, I still read Roald Dahl books to my kids. I'm not going to shy away from the fact he's a brilliant writer, but at the same time, I'm more than happy to lift the lid on the horrifying underpinnings of the man. And it's so galvanizing that work like that has a place not only at the Royal Court, but in the West End, and audiences want to be exposed to unpleasant conversations that can leave them feeling uncomfortable. It makes the theatre world better. People can't just be written off. There has to be some form of interrogation of, can an individual find salvation? And I feel like that's something that we might come on to a bit later in the podcast.
Well, we could talk about it a tiny bit now, because it is the theme of Robert Icke's work, that, I think. And he gave an excellent interview to the Financial Times this week ahead of Manhunt, which is his play about Raoul Moat. And he won at the Oliviers for his production of Oedipus, which was Best Revival, and Leslie Manville won for her devastatingly wonderful performance as Jocasta. And the trick that Robert Icke, it's unfair to call it a trick. What Robert Icke does is make you care about flawed protagonists. And he does it over and over and over again, whether it's in Greek drama or Chekhov or Shakespeare. He's interested in the interrogation of what it is to be human. And that sounds such a sort of pompous thing to say, but it's one of the things that theatre is utterly brilliant about. It's allowing you to say that in life, you meet a lot of people who are flawed, and that even people who are evil have a reason why they're evil. And maybe, theatre suggests and philosophy suggests, maybe it's better to understand why people do bad things rather than simply to write them off as evil. And as the discourse has moved in one direction in terms of media and social media, which is where everything gets very black and white, theatre is brilliantly holding that line of saying, let's pause and let's think and let's try and understand. And what I liked about about Giant is it does that with real rigor and a kind of grace. And I think Icke does it as well, always. He holds a space where you can talk about difficult things. And it's brilliant that Giant, A, won 3 awards, and B, is having a transfer, not least because when they were discussing it originally with the Royal Court and with David Byrne, there was some doubt about whether it could go on at all because the time seems so fevered. And, I think hats off to David Byrne as well at the Royal Court that he did hold a line and say, no, we'll do this play. This is the kind of play we should do.
The David Byrne being an incredible artistic director theme was a recurrent one in the winner's room with many of the speeches. Elliot Levy talking about how the Royal Court has found its ability to once more ask the unpleasant questions in a way that it would have done in the 1950s. And the masterstroke that David Byrne had for a venue that was kind of swaddled in a very controversial and thorny discussion around anti-Semitism because of some of the programming history, to then be the one that defiantly stands by a play to say, no, let's jump into that and discuss it and interrogate it, kind of hit a hard reset on that discussion and said, look, David Byrne wants to have these conversations. He's not going to be partisan. He wants the Royal Court to be a place for everyone. That for me is brilliant programming. To be aware not only of what makes work great, but also what makes a venue great within a theatre ecosystem. But doing it also when you know your bottom line is not where you want it to be. And there's been some brilliant interviews. I think Andrzej Lukowski did an interview in The Stage with David Byrne last week about how the financial pressures surrounding the Royal Court do make it harder to go on, but actually someone like David Byrne is probably the best man for the job after what he did at the new Diorama Theatre. The giant wins, again, feel like they reflect something very exciting about British theatre and people who want to make British theatre in a way that doesn't feel lazy or sort of like an easy cash-in, but actually ask the difficult questions. Something also that came across with Alina Arbo winning for Best Director for The Years, a play that also is so unflinching. And actually now as a parent to a daughter, that feels like such a warn, like, I'm a parent to a daughter.
No, it's a good line.
Yeah,
Stick with it.
But it does affect the way that I see a play like The Years, because that's almost offering me just an opinion on what a life will be like. So I think I'm treating it now in a very different way to how I would have done 6-7 months ago when it was first on the Almeida.
So the genius of The Years is that, which Romola Garai also won for
beat herself.
Devastating. I used devastating twice, but I think both she and Manville probably had the two most shocking scenes on the London stage in the past year, in the sense that, I won't give away the plot of Oedipus, but Jocasta has to cope with a terrible revelation. Romola Garai was the actress of the 5 who create the single character of a woman in The Years, who did this scene, which was in the abortion clinic, which left people fainting, literally, seemingly every night, actually. So they had to cope with that. I think the thing about The Years is twofold. One is I'm thrilled it won. It's threefold. Thrilled it won for a woman director, still a rare category win. And also I'm glad it's a justification for Rupert Gould's programming at the Almeida, which, again, has had a very consistent, sure sense of itself. They've just opened UNESCO's Rhinoceros there in another radical, challenging, exciting production, which we're going to be talking about in the podcast next week with Anushka Lucas. And the bravery of Rupert's line at the Almeida has been noticeable. And so it's lovely that play came from the Almeida, came from all the support given to it there and transferred to the West End. So that little bit of the theatre ecology, which says you can be an inspired artistic director and nurture something, and then transfer it somewhere else so more people get to see it, that does seem to be surviving. And that brings us, I hope elegantly, onto Benjamin Button, which was the other 3 prizes at the Oliviers. And you have loved that show right from the beginning.
Yes, I'm going to take you back to the summer of 2019. Myself and the lovely critic Alan Hood, who writes regularly for WhatsOnStage, were comparing notes about some of our favourite musicals. And he turned to me and he said, you have to go and see this 5-man Curious Case of Benjamin Button in the little space at the Southwark Playhouse. And at that point, I had actually gone into the attic of Southwark Playhouse and been in rehearsals with the cast, hearing some of the numbers being performed. So I was like, okay, this is actually a really lovely show. And being in that space with the director and the composer, when it was literally like, it's probably like the space of this room. And we were just like, I was hearing them jam, hearing some of these numbers for the first time. So Alan was like, okay, 5 stars, Curious Case of Benjamin Button. And then back to him. I said, well, if I'm going to Southwark Playhouse, you need to go to the new Diorama Theatre because there's a brilliant five-hander musical called Operation Mincemeat. And that is something that is going to be huge. And so we were both like, well, which one's going to be bigger? Who knows? And now, back-to-back years, we've had off-West End hits that started at the same time in fringe venues, the Southwark Playhouse and New Diorama Theatre, on the biggest London stage, winning Best New Musical. And that is such a huge tribute to the valuable presence of the off-West End space, often overlooked, almost always underfunded, and yet
so underfunded.
But producing work that is being celebrated across the industry as the best musical output of the year. And the fact that it's happened twice in a row, it means that Operation Mincemeat wasn't a fluke. Clearly, there is something there about brilliant artists who, when they get recognised by big producers, say Avalon in the case of Operation Mincemeat or ATG in the case of The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, and those producers allow the show time to marinate and evolve and grow, and then they hit the West End at the right moment with the right level of cultivation, the results can be world-beating. And that's what has happened. And I think that Jethro Crompton put his own personal money into the show when it was first opening. It was done on a shoestring budget, and now it's performing with 14 active musicians on the Royal Albert Hall stage and winning 3 Olivier Awards.
Yeah, I think it's gone from a budget of like 7,000 to, it must be slightly more than that, 70,000 to 2 million. I mean,
Wow.
As it's expanded. And I think there are 2 really fascinating things about The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. The first is that you've always got this idea with musicals that the 2 people writing them, the lyricist and the composer, are lifelong friends, and they've always dreamed of producing a musical, which is very much the Six model with Toby Marlowe and Lucy Moss. Another brilliant podcast, which I am going to plug here and suggest that people listen to because it's such fun. But in fact, what's so interesting is that Dennis Crompton and Darren Clark didn't know each other, and they didn't know each other until 8 months, until they came together when they were trying to shape this story into a show. And I think that's fascinating because that's a different model of creation and has actually given it a kind of strength because they had to make decisions. They couldn't mull it so much. So they shaped it really strongly. And then they were given time to develop it. So they got it on in pretty good nick. And then ATG have backed them and given them time, given them space, let them expand from the 5 to the 17, recast it. Because it was Jamie Parker you saw originally, wasn't it?
No, so it was, but it was 5 strong. I think it was a lot of Jethro Crompton's regulars. And then it was Jamie Parker and Molly Osborne when it was at Southwark Playhouse Elephant. And now it's John Dalgleish, who also won an Olivier Award, and Claire Foster, who took over for the West End run. So each time it's had different leading stars in it. Yeah.
And John Dalgleish took home the Olivier for Best Performance in a Musical. Sorry, I realised I called Jethro Crompton, Dennis Crompton, who is a cricketer. I apologise.
I think Jethro wouldn't mind. He's I can imagine him being a good cricketer in another life.
Do apologise. It's the first Crompton that came to mind. But I do think that's so interesting. And hopefully now it has got the opportunity, at least, to follow the same track as Operation Mincemeat and indeed Six and be a hit all around the world because it's an F. Scott Fitzgerald story. It may have been moved to Cornwall, but it's not a specifically Cornish theme. It's got legs and it's really lovely. And it's lovely that you've watched it through and that Alan has watched it through. Alan was doing a lot of tweeting in a very excited way when the Oliviers were happening.
It's one of the unusual shows that's had 15 stars from What's on Stage across 3 reviews. So I think the last play to have that was Iphigenia and Splot. So in good company. The other funny thing about both Operation Mincemeat and The Curious Case of Benjamin Button is whenever I recommend it to friends who might not go to the theatre very often, they'll be like, oh, but I didn't really enjoy the film very much. I didn't like the Operation Mincemeat film, and I didn't like the Benjamin Button film, so I don't know why I'd enjoy seeing it on stage. And I just think, this has got nothing to do with the films. They are completely standalone. And there is zero crossover with the Brad Pitt film versus what Jethro Compton and Darren Clarke put together in The Curious Case of Benjamin Button musical, because it's relocated to the Cornish coast. It's all very nautical. It's that brilliant idea of time and tide, and the way in which time washes to and fro. I hope it sticks around in the West End. I hope it keeps finding that audience. It's quite an intimate space at the Ambassadors, in a similar way to Operation Mincemeat at the Fortune. Fingers crossed those can become boutique premium musicals that could have long runs in the West End, and bring audiences and say, look, musicals can be something different. That was actually something that Mamouna Mamon said when she won for Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812. She picked up the award for Best Supporting Actress in a Musical. Talking to her about what it means to watch a musical and to respond to what a musical is, she says that whenever anyone turns to her and says, oh, I don't really like musicals very much, she says, no, you do, because if you like music, you can like a musical. You just haven't found the right musical, because musicals are just storytelling through music. And this is actually something that does get my goat. So I'm going to actually stand here and echo her. I was at a panel probably about 6 months ago, and Mamouna was there and she was talking, and she was saying how the number of times a producer or a venue will dress up a show as being a play with songs or music theatre or gig theatre, and not embrace the idea of that also being a musical. Because by doing so, you're almost admitting that maybe a musical has the moniker of a musical creates expectations, when actually, if you try and make the term musical, if you try and open up that tent to cover gig theatre, to cover play with songs, suddenly lots more people are interested in what it means to go and see a musical. They might go and see a musical with 14 actor musicians playing folk instruments, or they might go and see a musical that's got rave dubstep elements like Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812. And it's great that she is carrying the torch for a musical being defined in so many different ways than a very limited subset. Sorry, that was a very long tangent, but I think that we do need to make sure that the term musical can apply to a huge array of things rather than just one specific thing in the West End.
I totally agree with that. And I also think, when I was first going to the theatre, all the musicals were Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice and so on. And at that time, because I was a punk, I wasn't really in love with those musicals, and I felt they were too establishment. Though actually now I realise they were groundbreaking in a different way, and I have also come to love them. But it was discovering Stephen Sondheim through cabaret singers singing Stephen Sondheim that took me into musicals, and then seeing Sweeney Todd at Drury Lane, and I thought, wow, this is different, dark, miserable, death. I like this. And I think that is true, that if you narrow the definition of what a musical is, then you're damaging it as a really powerful form. And that business about when you can't express something any other way, you sing or you dance, dance being important to me, I think that is a really necessary part of theatre going. That's also in contrast to something like, Hello Dolly, we just mentioned en passant, where Imelda Staunton won her 5th Olivier, which is astonishing, actually, my goodness. And actually, what they did with that was turn a very glitzy show into a psychological journey. So that's another redefinition. You can't get a more kind of Broadway show than Hello Dolly. It's never done very well here because it is so razzle-dazzle, tap dance your way down the stairs. But that, in the hands of Dominic Cook and Imelda Staunton, it became something else. It genuinely became a slightly melancholy story of a widow trying to make her way in the world, and kept all the razzle-dazzle, tap your way down the stairs.
The third big musical winner at the Olivier Awards was Titanique, the musical comedy that fell not into the musical categories for the show, but into Best Entertainment or Comedy, where it triumphed over Ballet Shoes and Inside Number 9. And I think Spirited Away was the other one in that category.
Yeah.
It's funny, therefore, 3 very different musicals being the ones that get more than one prize and could not be more different. And Titanique, again, does not fit the conventional model for a musical because it's essentially just a comedy lampoon with Celine Dion songs in it. And wonderfully, Leighton Williams' speech when he won for Best Supporting Actor in a Musical was hilarious. He said, "Oh my God, I've just won an Olivier for playing an iceberg." It's just like,
exactly.
What is that? That is not a sentence that will ever be repeated on the Royal Albert Hall stage. But it's true. And like, where else would you find a show that allows someone to win an Olivier Award for playing an iceberg?
Yeah, so true. It's so true. And I mean, I enjoyed Titanic, as you know, and I thought it had legs as a show. I mean, it's a joy and very, very smart. I slightly feel that Ballet Shoes was robbed in that category and that Titanic did benefit from the voters wanting a show that was still on. Nevertheless, you know, Leighton Williams is a joy as an iceberg. There is no doubt. He has such fun. And one of the other things about that is just how inclusive that is as a show. That I went like an iceberg, you know, very sort of grumpily, opened quite a cold night in January, as I recall. Didn't want to go. Said, don't like Celine Dion. Do quite like Titanic, the film, but it was sort of very much in my little theatre critic's cocoon. And by the end, I was on my feet, waving my arms around, singing along. I mean, it was great, and it is great fun. And that's the other. It's great quality as a show, is its assertion that theatre, having said all those serious things about theatre, about how it allows you to solve problems, it also allows you to have a jolly good time. And it definitely falls into that category of just being a hoot.
Speaking of Imelda Staunton winning, there was a moment in the press room. So she did all her photos in front of the board with her Olivier, and then almost just sort of like just decided to stride through the winner's room and not talk to any of the video outlets. Just almost like the parting of the Red Sea. Everyone just moved out of the way for the Queen and let her just carry straight back on into the auditorium to sit back down. It's just, you know, it's like, we respect Imelda Staunton. She does exactly what she pleases.
She does what she wants.
It's her 5th time winning. Yeah, she can do anything she wants. I think she dedicated the award to her mother, and that was a really poignant moment. There was a lot of thanking parents and family and thinking about a love of theatre as an inherited quality, and that's really wonderful. And maybe that's something for me now that feels more pertinent now that I have a daughter, to think about, you know, what she might or might not inherit from me. But
and of course it will become very pertinent with Imelda when she does Mrs. Warren's Profession with her daughter Bessie Carter, an actress I love. That's coming up shortly. I think it opens in May. Do you think it's time to move on to some of the things we've got looking forward to?
Is it time to
have been announced this week?
Yeah, turn our heads to the future instead of looking back at a year of theatre. So yes, I think yesterday, speaking of Olivier Award winners, Bryan Cranston coming back to the London stage in a production of All My Sons, directed by Ivo van Hove, which raises a slight eyebrow because Ivo van Hove's had some interesting headlines written about him over the last year. But I think he's performing alongside Marianne Jean-Baptiste and Papa Essiedu. So, you know, that casting is pretty incredible. At the same time, the Wyndhams, which clearly is the theatre that everyone wants to be performing in, is going to be home to Born with Teeth, which is Liz Duffy Adams's two-hander about the relationship between William Shakespeare and Kit Marlowe. I think it was seen in the States originally a couple of years ago. And that's coming with Ncuti Gatwa and Edward Blumenauer. So again, premium casting. Already it's like, well, the Olivier Awards for next year have already got some strong contenders in the bag.
Exactly. And you can see some themes coming through. I mean, it's clear celebrity casting isn't going to go away. But then in terms of celebrity casting, as I keep saying. It depends on the celebrity. And if you get a celebrity who can act, as we know Bryan Cranston can from his performance in Network, then that revival of All My Sons is so enticing. It's one of my favourite plays. I think in many ways I like it better than I like Miller's more famous plays. Certainly more than The Crucible, which I think sometimes implodes under the weight of its own seriousness. And I love All My Sons because it is a family drama. I mean, it's that great American tradition of using the family drama as a refraction of society. And that cast is just stunning. I mean, I can't wait for that.
Yeah.
And I'm riveted by the idea of Chuti coming to do a play that did well in New York, I think. And it's obviously interesting because it's an American view of a British subject.
Yeah.
And I'm intrigued by that. And as you say, Wyndham's is the place to be. So it's already got gold dust scattered around it before it even opens.
It's also interesting that Born with Teeth has got the RSC attached to it because they're also bringing over Fat Ham in the autumn, which is another American vision of Shakespeare. So they're almost pioneering that as an artistic programming option. Amongst other things, they do an incredible amount of work, and their football take on Much Ado About Nothing is just starting performances, isn't it, in Stratford?
Yes, I've booked myself in for press night.
Nice.
I'm going to face the train back from Coventry, which is always a challenge because it's very
like
late.
Just like the League One fans, Sarah.
It is. It's exactly like that. And but for a football inflected Much Ado About Nothing, I'm going to be there. But perhaps on those two high notes of things to come up, shortly I should let you go back to trying to get some sleep from your disrupted nights.
I would also like to quickly correct myself that Coventry is in the Championship rather than in. I don't want any Coventry fans coming from me, as we are both former Coventry residents. That would be
exactly. I was there when they won the FA Cup.
Oh, so wow! There you go. Gosh, yeah, that's how the mighty have fallen. Sorry,
exactly. In almost every way.
Oh dear. Okay, right, yes.
I like the way we've started a podcast with the Olivier Awards and ended it with football. Perfect.
We often do that, yeah. We can talk more about Paul Gascoigne when we next have a chance after Manhunt.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
I should look forward to do that in our next episode. But for now, I think it's probably time to say goodbye from me, Sarah Crompton.
And a goodbye from me, Alex Wood. Make sure you like, follow, subscribe, leave a comment or post a rating wherever you can. We'll be back with a brand new episode next Friday. So make sure you tune in.